Hello dreamers, and welcome to this 260th episode of California Dreaming. Before we get started, I have a few notes about the show. This is an independent, ad-free podcast, which means I depend solely on you, the listeners, to help keep the show going and growing. And there are a number of ways that you can help. You can recommend us in true crime discussion groups and fan groups. You all have been really good about that, and I appreciate it very much. On Facebook, if you do recommend the show, tag me so that I can thank you. You can leave a nice rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. I get weekly notifications when you do that, and I appreciate those 5 stars. Also, follow the show on all the social medias, join the Facebook group, follow me on Instagram and Twitter. And if you would like to help a little bit more and you have an extra $1 or $2 each month, and you need some additional exclusive content, subscribe to the show's Patreon. There are dozens of episodes that are there for the binging. They're just like the regular ones, so it's a pretty decent deal, and it's the only way I generate revenue, so it's very helpful. And if a subscription isn't what you're looking for, but you would still like to help out the show, you can make a one-time donation through PayPal using the email californiapod@gmail.com. This week, I would like to thank Teen S, Darren A, Gina B, Dean S, Bridget C, Dennis R, Tim V, and Tina C for either joining Patreon, rejoining, raising their pledge, or making a one-time contribution. Also, I have an update on my babysitting job. For those of you who don't know, I moonlight as a childcare provider. For the next month or so, I'm going to be working kind of a lot of hours, but starting in June, I'm going on a little bit of a break, kind of like a summer, fall vacation, and I'll only be working a couple of days a week until the new baby is born. Yes, the mom is having a second child, so it's going to give me more time to focus on this show and on the Patreon. I have a whole bunch of thank you cards for those who have subscribed that I need to mail out to everyone. I'm going to try to have a giveaway in June, and I'll be on the social medias a lot more than I have been. And hopefully I'll find some time to do some collaborations with other podcast hosts while I have this downtime. So if you're feeling like I'm slowing down, please fear not. Work has been busy, but come June, I will have a great deal of time to devote to this and to my dreamers for the remainder of 2023. The goal here is to get to episode 300 by the end of the year. So, as of the writing of this episode, there are 37 weeks left, so I can do this. All right, that's enough chit-chat. Let's get to today's episode. Before I actually get into the content, I do have to provide you with this warning. There is some sexually explicit material in this episode that may not be suitable for some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. This is a vacation series episode because I randomly got reminded of this case, and I don't think I remember it happening at the time, but I remember seeing it on an investigation discovery show. There is a little bit of a California connection. I can't remember if I put it down in my notes or not, but I will try to bring it up when I get to it. The backdrop of our story today is in one of the smallest towns that we've ever talked about on this podcast, Early, Iowa. As in early to bed, early to rise, EARLY. And this is the first time that we have ever had a case out of the state of Iowa. The Hawkeye State is also known as the Corn State because Iowa is the largest producer of corn in the country. I don't know if you guys are randomly hearing any loud screaming or yelling going on, but my apartment is overlooking the swimming pool and there are kids out there playing, so if you hear some of that going on in the background, that's what it is. I can't help it. Sorry. This isn't a professional recording studio. Anyway, Early is in the northwest corner of the state, not deep in the corner, but it is so small. The total area is 0.39 square miles or 1.01 square kilometers, and today the population is about 584. At the time our story took place back in 2001, the population was 605, so there hasn't been all that much of a change. And there really isn't anything spectacularly notable listed on Early's Wikipedia page, except for today's story. On the evening of December 13th, 2001, at approximately 7 p.m., a call came into the Sac County, Iowa 911 call center. The caller was 11-year-old Bert Pittman, and he said, "My mom, somebody came into the house, they tied her up, and they were choking her. My mom got to the gun and shot, and the other one ran off." It was very unusual for a town with a population that small to receive a call like this from a child. Emergency responders and police rushed to the scene. It's one of those places that when the call came in and they said there's been a shooting at the Roberts residence, everybody knew where to go. That was the home of Tracey Richter Roberts, and from this point forward, we're just going to refer to her as either Tracey Richter or just Tracey. She lived there with her husband, Michael, and their 3 children. However, the oldest child, the one who made the 911 call, is Tracey's son from her first marriage to Dr. John Pittman. I will tell you more about Tracey's various marriages, husbands, and relationships as we go along here. When police arrived, Tracey was sitting in the kitchen, quite visibly upset. All the information that officers had at the onset was that there was a shooting and that there were 2 individuals who entered the home and attacked Tracey. It was very unusual for law enforcement to be having to deal with such a violent crime as this in what is described as small-town Iowa. And as they were learning the details of this apparent home invasion attack or robbery, or whatever it was meant to be that ended up turning deadly for at least one of the perpetrators, police were perplexed by the confusing and chaotic scene. One of the first things that didn't make any sense was that there was no sign of a forced entry, no kicked-in doors, no indication that there was a break-in, no broken windows, and there was no sign that there was even a robbery. There was nothing really disturbed. There was no indication that there was any kind of a struggle. Nothing had been searched through or ransacked, and nothing appeared to have been taken. So the initial thought by investigators was that the motive for this break-in wasn't a robbery, but rather something a bit more personal. Upstairs in the master bedroom of the house was one of the intruders who had been shot dead. And as far as the second intruder, the house was thoroughly searched and he was long gone, nowhere to be found. When the detectives made their way up to the second floor, they went into Tracey's bedroom and found a body laying face down in a pool of blood, with what initially appeared to be at least 2 bullet wounds to the back of the head. So it was immediately clear that this young man was beyond help. The smell of gunfire still hung in the air as investigators looked at the body and the area surrounding him. The lead detective on the case went back downstairs and into the kitchen to speak to Tracey. As he sat across the table from her, he noticed that it did appear that she had some red markings around her neck, indicative of having been choked by some sort of object. I saw the pictures of the marks on her neck, and it's clear that they weren't made by an attempt at manual strangulation, but they also didn't really quite appear to be made by any kind of strangulation. Tracey was asked to explain what had happened, including the things that happened in the day leading up to the attack. Tracey said that she was home alone with her 3 children that day, that her husband was away on business. She said that Dustin Wehde, who was a friend of their family, the son of a friend of theirs, had come by the house that afternoon unexpectedly, and that she didn't have a whole lot of time to speak to him because she was busy with her children. A little while later, Tracey put a movie on for her 11 and 3-year-old, Bert and Noah, while she gave her 1-year-old baby named May a bath. Tracey said that it was sometime between 6 and 6:30 p.m. that she heard someone coming up the stairs. She said that she thought perhaps it was her husband, so she called out Michael's name asking if that was him, even though she had just said that she knew her husband to be out of town on business. She said that she looked out of the bathroom and into the hall, and that's when she heard 2 people coming up the stairs. And right away, she realized that something was very wrong. So Tracey took her 1-year-old out of the bathtub, went down the hallway and into the bedroom where her 2 boys were watching a movie. Because she had all kinds of time to do that with 2 strangers coming up the stairs that she could see from her vantage point in the bathroom doorway? Okay. She said that she told the 2 of them to hold the baby and do not come out of the bedroom no matter what happened. And just as she was giving them these instructions, she described being grabbed from behind by one of the intruders, right there in the bedroom where her 3 children were located, who apparently witnessed this whole thing. Tracey screamed and yelled for her son to shut and lock the door. Tracey then said she continued to struggle with her attacker in the hallway, and he attempted to place a ligature around her neck in order to strangle her. Tracey said that she was able to free herself from her attacker by using her own momentum and her body weight by slamming him, who was behind her, backwards into the wall. She then said she was able to take a few steps, but was stopped by one of the 2 attackers, and during this part of the struggle, her glasses were knocked off of her face, and once that happened, she was unable to see anything, describing herself as blind as a bat. She then said that she saw, yes, she saw, blind as a bat, Tracey saw that the item being used as a ligature was a pair of pantyhose, which one of the attackers managed to get around her neck and choked her to the point of unconsciousness. When Tracey came to, she said that she did not know how much time had passed or how long she had been knocked out for, but when she did come to, she heard the sounds of these 2 attackers trying to get into Bert's bedroom. So Tracey managed to get to her feet. She ran to her bedroom where she and Michael had a gun safe. And in her nervousness and chaos, it took her 3 times before she was able to get the combination correct in order to open the safe. Remember, blind as a bat, right? Just as Tracey was opening the door to the safe, one of the attackers came from behind again with the pantyhose, got it around her neck, and tried strangling her again. Tracey managed to reach into the gun safe, pulled out a Beretta, pointed it over her shoulder behind her, and pulled the trigger. Her attacker fell, and when Tracey sat up, she was able to see the second attacker flee and run down the stairs. So suddenly, when it was quiet, Tracey said she could hear breathing and that the attacker started moving. At this point, I believe there's a version of this story where she went and got her children. So imagine that she has her children with her, and then the rest of this happens. She could hear him breathing, that the attacker was starting to move. She pointed the gun that she still had in her hand at him and ordered him to not move. But he continued to try to get to his feet, so Tracey pulled the trigger again, but her gun was empty, so she reached into the safe for another handgun and fired 2 more fatal shots at him in the back of his head. Now, there's another version of the story that Tracey finished off the attacker without having her children with her. So at that point, her children still being in the bedroom, Tracey went there and she took them all downstairs, and that's when Bert called 911. Now, dreamers, I've kind of insinuated that there are some things about this story that seem a little off to me. And if things sound a little off to you as well, don't worry, we'll get to that. When Tracey was asked if she could describe the attackers, she said that the only thing that she could tell was that one of them was bigger than the other, and that she wasn't aware of the identity of the person that she had shot. And this is going to turn out to be a little bit questionable as well. When Tracey was asked if there was anybody that she knew who was wanting to do her harm, without any hesitation, she pointed her finger directly at her ex-husband, Dr. John Pittman. That would be Bert's father. So the detective started asking more questions about the nature of Tracey's relationship with her ex-husband, thinking that this was quite possibly an angle of this incident that needed to be explored more, especially if their divorce was particularly acrimonious. Tracey said that even though it had been more than 5 years since their divorce was finalized, her ex-husband was still very upset and very hostile towards her, and that he was in the process of trying to gain full and sole custody of Bert, which had been going on for many years and was very contentious. It seemed that John Pittman was on the verge of winning his motion for full primary custody at the time that the shooting took place. Tracey told the investigators that if something were to happen to her, if she were removed from the equation, then Dr. John would get exactly what he wanted. So, dreamers, I'm already wondering, why did Dr. John file for custody modification? And more importantly, why was he on the verge of getting it? And if he was on the verge of getting his way, then what would be the motivation to harm his ex-wife if he was already winning? We'll see if we can answer those questions as we go along here. So as the investigators were sitting there getting the dirt on Tracey, they were alerted to an urgent phone call, and it turned out to be Tracey's current husband, Michael. He's from Australia, and he was away at the time on business in Minnesota. He had been trying to call home for quite some time and finally became so exasperated that he ended up phoning their next door neighbor, and that neighbor had told him what had just happened at his house. So as the detective spoke to Michael, who was pretty frantic, he was told that his family was okay, and then he was asked if his wife had any enemies that he knew of. And the first thing that came flying out of Michael's mouth was, "Go ask Tracey about the dentist in Chicago." Okay, wait, what? A dentist? We'll come back to that in a moment. First, let me tell you a little bit more about husband number one, Dr. John. So Tracey and John met in either 1984 or 1985 when she was about 19 years old and a student at Northwestern University, Chicago, where she was studying radiology, and John was a fourth-year medical student. They both became very interested in each other right from the start, and soon the two of them were making plans for a very bright and successful future together, both of them in the medical field. 2 years after they started dating, John began his residency, which was in Denver, Colorado. So they moved there together and in short order got married. They were both working at the same hospital, and as far as anyone could tell, the couple were very happy together. Eventually, Dr. John became a cosmetic reconstructive surgeon, and soon they were expecting their first child, Bert, who would be born in 1990. However, as soon as Tracey became pregnant, Dr. John noticed a very abrupt and striking change in Tracey's behavior. She became very erratic, unsteady, volatile, causing him to become tremendously concerned. Their relationship was riddled with incessant fights, always instigated by Tracey. She threw tantrums over money, and her behavior had turned exceedingly manipulative. After Bert was born, the problems only escalated even more. Tracey stopped working to become a stay-at-home mom, which only added to the list of Tracey's grievances. Being home all alone, having to take care of their son, being bored and lonely. The list went on and on. Dr. John reported that during one particular argument, things got so bad, Tracey actually grabbed a gun, held it to his face, telling him that he would never leave the house again. I'll tell you more about this incident a little bit later on in the story. Also, when Bert was around the age of 3, Tracey filed charges alleging Dr. John was sexually abusing him. The allegations were investigated, and it was found that there was no evidence that such a thing was going on. Dr. John was cleared of any wrongdoing. After that incident, Dr. John was finding out that Tracey was having men coming and going from their home all hours of the day and night. And then he came to find that several of his credit cards had disappeared. This prompted John to hire a private investigator to try and figure out what Tracey was up to. The details of what the private investigator found seems to have been kept close to the vest, but apparently whatever it was that the PI did discover, he ended up strongly urging Dr. John to get out of Dodge fast because he believed his life to be in danger. Dr. John and Tracey did eventually divorce, and with that, a long, drawn-out custody battle ensued. But Tracey wasted no time getting hitched for a second time to a gentleman named Michael Roberts, an entrepreneur from Australia, whom she met online and married only 18 days after they met in person for the first time. They had 2 children together, a son, Noah, born in 1998, and a daughter, May, born in 2000. It did not take long for the same issues Dr. John had with Tracey to arise in her second marriage to Michael. The erratic behavior, the rampant infidelity, her financial indiscretions, it was all the same stuff. But Michael decided to try and stay for the sake of the children. There came a point where Dr. John started to become even more concerned about the type of environment Bert was being subjected to, living with a mom whom he believed to be quite unstable and unpredictable. That is what prompted him to decide in late 2001 that he was going to move forward with seeking sole custody of Bert. And it was a thing based on Tracey's history that Dr. John had a pretty good chance of having awarded in his favor. And Tracey knew that. So that was the status of the relationship between Tracey and Dr. John leading up to the evening of the break-in at Tracey's house. So that gives you a little bit of a background on Tracey's history with her husbands and her children. So getting back to the night of the shooting, Michael got word from a neighbor what was going on, and when he was asked by the detectives at the scene if he had any information, he told them to make sure that they asked Tracey about the dentist from Chicago. So they go back to Tracey and they did just that. What's up with this dentist in Chicago? Tracey said that his name was Dr. Joseph Laspisa, and that she used to work for his dentist office when she was living in Chicago. Back on August 11th, 1997, Tracey was placed under anesthesia for a surgical procedure on her jaw to be performed by Dr. Laspisa. But when she came to, she found him to be masturbating instead of having performed the surgery. She filed a sexual misconduct complaint with the Illinois Licensing Board, as well as a lawsuit against him. And the repercussions of all this, to me, seemed a little bit mild. But Dr. Laspisa lost his license to practice dentistry for a couple of months, so in essence it was suspended, and he was ordered to pay Tracey $6,500. I'll talk much more about this later on, but the reasons why that this may have been relevant at the time of the shooting was because the case with Dr. Laspisa was just settled 3 days earlier, on December 10th, 2001. The home invasion happened on December 13th. So from there, Tracey then provided law enforcement as much information as she could about the second intruder who managed to flee from the scene And with that, a bulletin was put out with the description of this person across Iowa, as well as the neighboring states. After speaking to Tracey, one of the detectives then spoke to Bert, Tracey's 11-year-old and the one who made that urgent 911 call. He described one of the attackers pounding on his bedroom door, telling him to shut up or else they were going to go after him too. Bert described hearing his mom screaming from the other room and that it scared him. And then one of the attackers did open his bedroom door and peered into the room. Bert saw the attacker but did not know who it was. The investigators were able to identify the person who was shot and killed while they were still there at the initial scene of the incident, and it turned out to be 20-year-old Dustin Wehde. They quickly put it together that this was the same young man whom Tracey said came by her home earlier in the afternoon, but said she didn't have time to sit and chat with him because she was busy with her 3 children. So the attacker apparently was no stranger to Tracey. She described him as a family friend. So it had become pretty clear to detectives that this was not a random home invasion type crime. This attacker was known to the victim. So the question here then became, why was 20-year-old Dustin Wehde there to strangle 35-year-old Tracey Richter? And another question that you all may be asking yourselves, why didn't Tracey Richter recognize him? We'll try to answer that as we go along here. When word got around to the townsfolk that Dustin was the one involved in this home invasion, everybody was stunned. This is an everybody knows everybody kind of a town, and everybody knew Dustin. And he didn't have any kind of a reputation that was neither good nor bad. Dustin was just a regular, unassuming guy. Nothing really remarkable about him. He was just pretty much a 20-year-old kid still trying to find his way in life, but not necessarily a terribly bad person. But the problem at the moment, while the detectives were standing around the scene of the incident, was more about why Tracey didn't recognize Dustin. Why didn't she tell them who he was? She said that she was unable to identify her attacker, but he hadn't done anything to disguise himself. Tracey's husband Michael came home from his trip sometime around midnight, about 4 hours or so after the 911 call was made. Investigators were still on the scene and they were anxious to speak to him. They were very curious about Dustin's relationship with him and his family. Michael just said he was a really nice young man who lived in the neighborhood, and occasionally they hired him to help around the house. They met Dustin through his mom, Mona, who had been their real estate agent and sold them their house, and she did help them with their online business as well. I'll talk more about that a little later on also. Michael revealed that Mona had shared with them some concerns that she had about Dustin. She worried about him. He didn't seem to be thriving or progressing well into adulthood. He had turned 20 back in August of 2001, but he had just graduated from high school a couple of months before that in June of 2001. Mona opined that perhaps Dustin had a learning disability that had not been recognized or diagnosed while he was in school. But even though he wasn't specifically diagnosed with whatever it was that he may have been struggling with, he was in the special education program at school because he was behind the rest of his peers. Michael said that the best way that he could describe Dustin was that he was a directionless soul, and that he and Tracey really wanted to help and support Mona and to see Dustin figure out his way in life, to somehow find a focus. So Michael tried hiring him to help do some of his work. Nothing too difficult, just sort of like an assistant, trying to teach him a few marketable skills. But it didn't really go very well, as Dustin had a hard time picking up on the work duties Michael was assigning him. On top of that, Tracey made it pretty clear that she did not like having Dustin around. So they kind of had to roll back on their relationship and interactions with him. And they started seeing less and less of him, not having him come over, and really hardly ever talking to him anymore either. Dustin's mom said that he was a little bit bothered as to why all of a sudden they didn't want to have anything to do with him, because he didn't understand. So Mona, who lived about 8 blocks away from Tracey and Michael's house, received a call the evening of the shooting. But it wasn't law enforcement calling her. It was her nephew, Brandon. He told her that something really, really terrible was happening over at Michael and Tracey's house. Mona quickly hung up the call and rushed over there. When she arrived, the place was surrounded with emergency vehicles and crime scene tape. Mona ran up to an officer who was standing out front making sure that nobody wandered into the scene, and she asked about the shooting, as it was her initial thought that the shooting involved Michael and Tracey, that one of them shot the other, and she was trying to find out who did what. But as she was waiting for some answers, Mona glanced over into the driveway and she spotted Dustin's car there. And she was like, wait, what is going on here? Is my son inside the house? And the officer said that he was. And then she asked if he was dead, and the officer said yes. Of course, Mona immediately wanted to go inside to see him, but she wasn't allowed to. She was told that she can't, that the place was considered a crime scene. And the words crime scene just really didn't register. It wasn't making any sense to Mona. And as she stood there trying to wrap her head around everything that was happening, she was thinking that this shooting was accidental. I mean, those things do happen, and that's just where her mind initially went. Mona was told again that she couldn't go inside and that it was best if she went home for the time being. Meanwhile, Tracey's husband Michael was working on trying to figure out what all was happening also. How did this happen? Why did this happen? While also trying to console his distraught wife. Nothing about what had gone on that night made any sense to them. But Michael was very supportive and understanding and assured Tracey that she did what she had to do. She needed to protect their children. She had no choice. But this whole entire incident cast a very dark cloud over the little town of Early, Iowa. It gave everyone a really uneasy feeling. People were nervous. People were on edge. Everyone knew Dustin, and everyone knew Tracey. For something like this to happen in their small town, it was very difficult to cope with, because the town had been so close-knit. Once the dust settled, the general sentiment that was going on around town was that Tracey was a hero. She showed a tremendous amount of courage in keeping her family safe from a violent attacker, and that violent attacker was Dustin Wehde. That aspect of this whole thing was so puzzling because it went against everything that the people of Early knew Dustin to be. But as it was, he did what he did, and he put Tracey in a position where she did what she had to do. The following day, the detectives on the case visited Mona at her home, and they expressed their condolences for the loss of Dustin. At that point, when they showed up at her house, Mona was still under the impression that this was some sort of tragic accident, that perhaps Dustin was messing around with one of Tracey and Michael's guns and accidentally discharged the weapon, shooting and mortally wounding himself. One bullet wound she expected to find out that Dustin had been inflicted with. But the detectives had the delicate task of telling her what they found happened through their investigation so far. And at some point, Mona learned that Dustin did not have one bullet hole in him. Not 2, not 3, but 9. Her son was shot 9 times. The detectives explained Tracey's story of what went down in the house, that Dustin had come into the home with another assailant and they attacked Tracey. They tried to strangle her with a pair of pantyhose. and she managed to fight back. And the way that the investigators told Mona the story, it sounded as if Dustin was trying to murder Tracey and all of her children too. Her son attempted to murder a mother and her children is what Mona is hearing. She was just in absolute stunned disbelief and silence as she sat there and listened to what these officers were telling her. And there were people in the community who heard this and had the same reaction, that does not sound like Dustin at all. He's a young man that doesn't have it in him to do anything like this. He would never try and hurt anybody, especially young children. Dustin's vehicle was confiscated by police and brought down to their tow yard to be secured until they were able to obtain a search warrant and for the investigators to come down to take a look inside. And once they did, they found on the passenger seat of the vehicle some astounding evidence. There was a spiral-bound notebook with a pink cover, and on the inside, it read like it was a journal of whomever it was that wrote it. It's important to note that the discovery of this notebook and its contents were kept a very closely guarded secret for a very long time. Nobody knew the existence of this notebook. So, on one of the pages it was written, quote, "One day about 20 years ago, a boy was born into a middle-class life to a couple still in their young adult years of their life." And the handwriting, it was not good. In fact, to be honest with you, dreamers, it's some of the worst penmanship I've ever seen. But because of how distinctively not good this handwriting was, it was easy to be identified as being Dustin's handwriting, as he had some interesting ways of forming some of his letters. I'll put some screenshots of some of the pages on social media when this episode comes out. Later on in the notebook, there were several pages with some references to Tracey's ex-husband, Dr. John Pittman, and it reads as follows. And how I got this is I took some screenshots using my iPad so I could look at it. I could zoom in and look at it in order to see what words were being formed because it is very hard to read. So it said, number 1, decided to keep journal to gather my thoughts and to make record of a mysterious fellow who has asked me to work for him, in parentheses, John Pittman. Side note 1, not trusting. Number 2, JP, who is John Pittman, wishes me to keep watch and investigate on his wife, which he is divorcing. Number 3, JP is now acting/behaving curiously strange. Number 4, I know nothing of this mysterious fellow. I'm leaving in the grammatical errors, by the way, though I strive to learn all that I can. Side note number 2, JP equals some sort of doctor from Williamsburg, Virginia, wanted to be a shrink, family disapproved, father was a surgeon of sorts, family wished JP to follow in father's footsteps and take over father's practice. JP equals white male in 40s with a quote-unquote thing for strippers and hookers, slightly overweight and out of shape, Army Reserves, tortures victims. Has had me make prank calls on soon-to-be ex-wife. Number 5, JP has an obsessive hatred of his wife, in parentheses Tracey Richter, and wife much despised. JP with hatred. Reverted back to maiden name, TR, which is Tracey Richter, equals neat freak, seems antisocial, bitchy. I perceive TR equals untrustworthy of others, seems very defensive. I suspect that her son Bert was abused by JP. Number 6, Stephen Comey equals dirty lawyer, defends dirtbags, is my usual contact, sends me phone cards to avoid phone records and uses email. I've met SK once in person, in parentheses legal stuff for JP. SK equals slimeball dirtbag. Stephen Comey is Dr. John's divorce attorney. Number 7. JP wants me to get/force his ex TR to kill her son Bert and then commit suicide. And if that plan fails, plan B is to make it appear as though TR had committed the murder of her son and then committed suicide. Number 8. JP claims he loves his son but strongly wants his son dead. Number 9. JP brags/claims he's the victim. Number 10. JP wants me to kill his parents, making it appear that his new wife killed them. He wants me to do this to inherit his parents' fortune, stop his parents' control over him, and rid himself of his parents. As the detectives were reading this, they were quickly putting it together that Dr. John Pittman was Tracey's ex-husband, and here they were reading a journal entry where Dustin Wehde is writing that Dr. John has asked him to work for him. So this brings up a huge question. How does Dustin know Dr. John? Investigators are going to have to try and figure this out, but from what they're gathering from the entries in this pink notebook, it sounds like Dr. John may have hired Dustin to murder Tracey and Bert. And if you're thinking that the writings in this notebook are totally bizarre, like if John is the one doing the hiring of this kid to kill his ex-wife and his own son, I mean, it doesn't make sense that he wants to kill his own son when he's fighting so fiercely to get custody of him. But anyway, why is Dr. John telling Dustin all this negative stuff about himself and his attorney? None of this stuff made any sense, and it only added to the puzzlement of the case. Like I said, the detectives on the case, along with the crime scene analyst who conducted the search of the car, wanted to make sure that nobody knew about that notebook, not even any other officers in the department. They were well aware of how small town gossip can spread very quickly. So from that point forward, nobody knew the existence of that pink notebook, with the exception of the very select few individuals who were involved in discovering it inside Dustin's vehicle. So from there, the lead detectives on the case contacted their counterparts in Williamsburg, West Virginia, to do a background check on Dr. John Pittman. With the information the detectives now had out of that notebook, they went back to Dustin's mom with some follow-up questions. Mona was asked if her son kept a journal, and she said absolutely not. Dustin never kept a journal. He hated writing. Based on his penmanship, I would say the kid absolutely detested writing. Mona even said that he did not like to write, and that was one of the main reasons why his teachers thought he had a learning disability. Then Mona was asked if Dustin knew a Dr. John Pittman, a surgeon out of Williamsburg, West Virginia, and she said no, not at all. Dustin would have had no clue who that was. And the last question the detectives had, does Mona have any idea of who the second intruder may have been? And Mona was pretty adamant. Dustin hardly knew anybody. He didn't go anywhere. He didn't have any friends. He's just not the kind of person that hangs out. And he certainly didn't have anyone that he would partner up with to do something like this. And you know, dreamers, usually I take the word of close family of defendants or decedents with a grain of salt, because almost always they want their loved one to be portrayed in the light most positive and flattering for them. But when Mona said that Dustin didn't have friends that he hung out with like that, I believed her, because if there was a chance at getting the second person who was with Dustin when that home invasion was carried out, as Tracey told it, to come forward, I don't think Mona would hide that information. I don't think she would hide, hesitate, or lie about it. I believe Mona would be handing over every single name that she could think of in order to get to the truth as to what happened to her son inside that house that night. Not for a second do I think that she would hide or protect anybody else. Mona even said that she really appreciated it when Tracey's husband went out of his way to befriend her son because he really didn't have anybody else. At that time, investigators also asked for a sample of Dustin's known handwriting, which Mona willingly turned over. And like I said, they quickly ascertained that it was the same handwriting. The next person the detectives wanted to follow up with was Tracey Richter herself. Among the questions that she was asked included, why is it that Dustin would want to do something like this? Why would he want to try and harm her? Tracey brought up the fact that she and Michael had previously spent time with him on a regular basis. They, particularly her husband Michael, had sort of taken him under their wing, as I described earlier, and they started to really consider him to be a friend. And then there came a time when things just weren't working out, and Tracey said that she wasn't comfortable having him around her children anymore, so they stopped associating with Dustin. And Tracey said when that happened, Dustin was really upset about it, and he couldn't quite understand why they no longer wanted a relationship with him, and he didn't seem to be able to get over it very well. And maybe this was his way of getting back at them. At the time, the detectives thought that that was a plausible angle to look into based on what they knew thus far about Dustin. And the detectives knew at that point that it was Tracey's husband, Michael, who was the one who tried to befriend Dustin to kind of try and help the kid out in finding some direction in his life, not Tracey. So they started to look into Tracey and Michael's marriage. After all, they still have to take into consideration the information that they found out in that pink spiral notebook where Dustin wrote all those things about Tracey's ex-husband, Dr. John. It very well could have been Michael who fed all that information to Dustin and set this whole thing up. Even more suspicious, it just so happened to have gone down when Michael was out of town on business. So yeah, investigators needed to explore this. Tracey and Michael met online sometime in late 1995. At the time, Tracey was living in Chicago. Michael was from Australia. He's described as an entrepreneur or a businessman, but it's all very non-specific in all the information that I was able to find related to this case. But whatever Michael was into, he seemed to have been able to travel a lot and work from basically anywhere. So he and Tracey talked online and on the phone for several months. She was in Illinois. Michael was in Brisbane, a coastal city in the state of Queensland. After communicating for a few months, Tracey flew to Australia to meet Michael in person, and only 18 days later they got married. Michael uprooted his entire life and moved to the other side of the world to Chicago to be with his new wife, and they would go on to have 2 children of their own. I mentioned earlier Noah in 1998 and May in 2000. Also in 1998, they relocated to Early, Iowa, where they launched a computer-based business they operated out of their home. And Mona, Dustin's mom, worked for them part-time. And from what everybody could see from the outside looking in, Tracey and Michael appeared to be happy and living an amazing life, raising a beautiful family. Yeah, and everybody thought the same exact thing about Tracey and Dr. John, and that ended quite poorly. So as investigators were digging into Michael and Tracey's relationship, they discovered a police report related to some sort of domestic incident from the year prior to the shooting back in 2000. Michael and Mona were in the room that Michael had turned into an office, and they were doing some work when Tracey just came stomping and storming into the room, screaming, waving a piece of paper around, demanding to know what this was. And Tracey was like seriously flipping out, just raging at the top of her lungs. And this paper apparently indicated that one of their clients who owed them somewhere around $20,000 had just filed for bankruptcy, and Tracey was blaming Michael for allowing something like that to happen. Mona was sitting there really embarrassed, and she could clearly see that this relationship was not all rainbows and unicorns as it appeared on the surface. Michael asked Mona if he and Tracey could speak in private, so she excused herself. Well, the following day, when Mona showed back up for work, she found Michael sulking in the living room. When she asked him what was wrong, he said that Tracey called the police. She accused him of domestic violence, and he had just got back from spending the night in the county jail. Mona tried to reassure Michael that things would work out in the end. And to an extent, on the legal end of things, the charges did end up being dropped. But the incident still raised red flags for investigators a year later when Dustin Wehde ended up shot to death in Tracey's apparent attempt to defend herself from being attacked. And all of this whole mess with the domestic incident from the year prior, sent Michael Roberts to the top of the investigator suspect list. Shortly after that, detectives got word from their counterparts in West Virginia and through their look into Dr. John Pittman that he had not been in Iowa in any recent times leading up to the attack, that there was no indication that he had any knowledge of or any communication with Dustin Wehde at all, and as far as anyone could see, Dr. John's alibi was solid, and he had absolutely nothing to do with the attack on his ex-wife. And let's not forget, Dr. John was on the verge of winning his petition for sole custody of Bert. So him orchestrating this attack on Tracey didn't really make any sense, much less orchestrating to have both Tracey and his son murdered. Why would he do that? Because he was winning. At that point, investigators really weren't able to develop anything further on either Michael or Dr. John because they weren't able to connect either one of them to Dustin or to the attack. And with that, this case began to grow cold. In addition to that, one of the lead detectives on this case had been a part of the investigative task force involved with the 9/11 terror attacks, which occurred only 3 months prior to Dustin's death. So once the investigation into who else was involved in the attack on Tracey began to sputter to a standstill, that investigator's focus had to turn back to working on the 9/11 task force. Making things even worse, another lead detective, actually a lieutenant at the time, a year after Dustin's death, ended up retiring. And that's tough for any investigation, because in a case like Dustin's, someone really, really has to care in order to want to try and figure it out. Because really, as far as anyone knew up to that point, based on everything Tracey had said, the bad guy was dead. Other than trying to track down the second attacker, there really wasn't all that much more to know, unless you were willing to keep digging. So another year after that, which would take us into late 2003, early 2004, investigators found out that Tracey and Michael had separated. So investigators had it in their minds that Michael had a pretty good idea as to what happened the night that Dustin was shot to death, and that perhaps now that he and Tracey were splitting up, that he might be willing to finally start opening up as to the truth about what he knew. The investigator who took over the case from the retired lieutenant asked Michael to come down for some follow-up questioning. But even though they pressed him for more information, Michael insisted that he had told them all he has to tell. So, once again, the case sputtered to a stop. It would be another 4 years before Dustin's case would get another look-see. This time, a special agent named Trent Valletta was assigned to the State Division of Criminal Investigations Cold Case Unit. And as he was going through some of the many cold case files that they had, Dustin Wehde's happened to catch his attention because as he read through some of the details and the facts of the case, Special Agent Valletta could not help but see that there were some pretty glaring inconsistencies, specifically in the account of the events that evening that Dustin was killed. The account that came from Tracey, the details that she provided, those were a little hinky. The thing that was the biggest red flag for Wehde was the actual shooting itself. And remember early on in the episode when I asked you if you thought that if there was something weird or off about Tracey's story, and I told you to not worry that I would be getting into all that? Well, we're about to be getting into all that. I did not buy Tracey's story at all, and I'm sure many of you didn't. The whole entire way she described that alleged struggle with Dustin, getting the better of him, managing to get her guns out of the safe, none of that added up to me, and probably to many of you listening as well. And finally, it was standing out to an investigator who was willing to take a good look at the case. The details of the shooting did not make any sense. Remember, Tracey said that there were 2 assailants, supposedly. She described this being a life and death struggle in the hallway with one of them. She's being strangled from behind with a pair of pantyhose, and then she passed out. And it's like, okay, what was happening then when she's knocked out cold? If they were there under the instructions of her ex-husband, Dr. John, and the job is to kill her and to kill Bert, then why didn't that happen? Tracey said she had no idea how long she was passed out for. It could have been a minute. It could have been 5 minutes. Whatever the case was, it was plenty of time for these 2 alleged intruders to kill somebody. So what the heck were these 2 attackers doing while the biggest threat in the house, Tracey, was passed out? They didn't take anything. They didn't ransack anything. And they certainly didn't kill anybody. They didn't kill the child, who would have been the easier one to kill, right? They didn't kill Tracey when she was at her most vulnerable, which was unconscious. What the heck were these 2 attackers doing? They were sent there to kill, according to the pink spiral notebook in Dustin's own handwriting. Maybe he's having cold feet or second thoughts? Maybe the 2 intruders were bickering about it. You kill her. No, you kill her. Maybe they were playing rock, paper, scissors to decide who has to do the killing. Or maybe there weren't 2 intruders. Yeah, I'm leaning towards that. But anyway, so these 2 intruders apparently are just standing around, twiddling their thumbs, doing whatever it is Tracey wanted the police to speculate that they were doing in her house while she had the chance to come too. And she ran to her bedroom. And she managed to get to her gun safe and entered the combination 3 times before she got it to open. And just as she was reaching for her handgun, she was attacked from behind yet again with pantyhose around her neck. So she points the gun over her shoulder. And when all is said and done, Tracey managed to get off 11 shots with 2 guns. And 9 of those bullets struck Dustin with nearly the precision of a sharpshooter. Some of those bullets were shot when Tracey alleged that Dustin was still moving and trying to get up to his feet. And at least one of those shots was fired at him after he was already dead. Special Agent Wehde was really skeptical about Tracey having been able to connect 9 out of 11 times in the midst of a life and death struggle, while she's supposedly being choked out from behind. And she isn't even facing her attacker. And those 9 shots just hit him with precision. Several of them were shot at him when he was already on the ground. In a TV show I watched about this case, almost all the shots were described as money shots. Every single one of them seemed like they were fired by someone who took careful aim. And that is contradictory to the story that Tracey told about her attacker and her struggling on the ground while she was shooting him while he is behind her over her shoulder. Wehde did not buy it. Another thing Wehde was stunned to find out about the whole case was this whole thing about this dentist from Chicago. Remember that whole mess? You know how Tracey had accused Dr. Joseph Laspisa of sexual misconduct while he had her under anesthesia? And then she ended up filing a complaint and suing him, causing him to lose his license for a few months and winning that $6,500 settlement. And all of that had just been finalized 3 days before this alleged attack. Wehde realized in looking over the case file that nobody ever went to interview Dr. Laspisa, which he felt like was a huge oversight into this investigation. So Special Agent Wehde traveled to Chicago to meet with Dr. Laspisa and to ask him what had happened with this sexual misconduct incident back in '97. By the time Wehde started coming around again asking him questions about this, 10 years had passed. But according to Dr. Laspisa, what happened between him and Tracey, as far as he was concerned, was consensual. They were having a good time, and then she turned around and basically destroyed his life and damn nearly ruined his career. As he tells it, they met in 1996. He was working at a hospital and she worked at that same hospital as a radiologist. And according to Dr. Laspisa, they became friends. Tracey managed to work her way into a position as his assistant in that she offered to help him with doing work around his office, like filing and the billing for his dental practice, and she offered to do it for free. And Dr. Laspisa happily accepted her offer to help. But before long, Dr. Laspisa began giving Tracey more responsibilities around the office, and she did a lot for him, even integrating a whole new electronic billing system, making things much more efficient and streamlined. And within a year, Tracey and Dr. Laspisa's relationship had turned intimate. But at the time, Tracey was married to her second husband, Michael. Now, dreamers, we are finally going to get a real good idea of exactly what Tracey's first ex-husband experienced in his marriage with her, particularly after she became pregnant with their child, Bert. Remember when it was described that Tracey had a very abrupt and distinctive change in her behavior? She became very erratic and volatile. They fought constantly. Tracey threw fits over money. She'd become extremely manipulative, and then after Bert was born, it grew even worse. Then she pulled that gun on him and even accused him of sexually abusing Bert. Well, get a load of what she did to Dr. Laspisa, and this is absolutely one of the most insane things I've ever heard anyone do. I mean, I would even go so far as to say even Helen and Olga would be like, what the fuck? We're not even that crazy. So get this. Tracey and Dr. Laspisa had this ongoing sexual relationship. And that is what was at the center of Tracey's ways of manipulating men, using sex to entice and control. And I mean like kinky sex. So on that evening, when Tracey ended up accusing Dr. Laspisa of sexual misconduct, remember, her accusation was that she was having Dr. Laspisa perform some kind of surgery on her jaw, and when she came to, the surgery hadn't even taken place and he was standing there masturbating. Well, he told a wildly different version of what happened that night to Special Agent Wehde. He said that after hours that evening in his dentist office, Tracey made an indecent proposal. She wanted to have sex in his dentist chair while they huffed nitrous oxide in order to heighten the sexual experience. She told him that she had been fantasizing about doing that with him ever since she started working with him. So as they're getting down in his dentist chair, Tracey managed to talk Dr. Laspisa into trying some stronger sedatives that she could administer to him intravenously. And Dr. Laspisa went along. And Tracey ended up giving him enough of that sedative to render him completely unconscious, and he did not come out of it until 10 hours later. Dr. Laspisa woke up in his dentist chair 10 freaking hours later to find that Tracey had been long gone. And what he found on his stainless steel instrument tray, like he said, it destroyed his life and put his entire dental career in jeopardy. Dr. Laspisa got played bad. And it all started from the day that Tracey volunteered to work in his office for free. She had been planning and scheming this all along. Lesson learned, dreamers, nothing is ever for free. The thing that was on Dr. Laspisa's instrument tray was a contract. And this contract stated that he admitted to sexually assaulting her while she was sedated. Along with the contract, Tracey had some damning and incriminating, and I imagine incredibly embarrassing photos of him. And she had taken those pictures and prepared this contract all while he was knocked out. And in this contract, Dr. Laspisa had to admit to all of these things that she accused him of doing. I captured a screenshot of the contract on my iPad so I could zoom in and read it, and it was written on Dr. Laspisa's own letterhead. And at the top, it was titled Contractual Agreement. And this is what it said. This agreement between Joseph Anthony Laspisa, DDS of Melrose Park, Illinois, and Tracey Richter Roberts of Chicago, Illinois, a patient and occasional contracted employee of Dr. Laspisa's, is entered into on this 13th day of August. And I want to note that the year was left off of this contract, but it was 1997. Whereas Dr. Joseph Laspisa admits to willfully misrepresenting his ability to resolve TMJ, which is temporomandibular joint, it's like the jaw, pain that Miss Roberts had been experiencing after a motor vehicle accident on June 7th, 1997, with the sole intention of getting Tracey Roberts to consent to a quote-unquote fictional procedure that would require conscious sedation. Dr. Joseph Laspisa secretly intended to remove and replace articles of Tracey Roberts' clothing, fondle her breasts and genitals, take photographs of her, and make subliminal suggestions. Dr. Laspisa admits to having an addictive personality. His addiction range, and that's a grammar error, from deviant sexual behavior to pharmacological. Whereas on August 11th, Tracey Roberts awoke when the anesthesia mask slipped off her face to find herself clad in red thigh-high stockings, no panties, and stiletto-heeled pumps that were too small. In addition, her dress neckline was pulled down and her breasts exposed, and Dr. Joseph Laspisa was masturbating onto her chest with one of her legs raised over his shoulder. At this time, Tracey Roberts kicked him back and off of her, managed to get off the procedure chair, and grabbed the pepper spray attached to her keyring. Tracey Roberts noticed several explicit Polaroid photographs of herself on the counter and began to cry. Dr. Laspisa begged her to not call security or the police. He stated that he had friends in both places that would fix this incident for him. He offered to reach a mutual agreement with her that would spare Mrs. Tracey Roberts the embarrassment, humiliation, and stress of pressing charges against him. He tried to convince her to leave the Polaroid photographs, but she took them by threatening to spray him if he moved. Dr. Laspisa suggested that she wait for him to make a proposal the next day when they were calm so that they may reach a mutual agreement that would be in both of their best interests. The eventual agreement is as follows. Tracey Richter Roberts agrees to indemnify and hold harmless Joseph Anthony Laspisa, DDS, his employees, and agents from all liabilities, claims, damages, and penalties incurred as a result of any administrative, legal, or criminal proceeding in connection to the incidents described above, and she agrees to not report or discuss this incident with anyone, including but not limited to her spouse, medical staff, regulatory agencies, etc., and has returned all photographs and semen-stained clothing to Dr. Joseph Laspisa in exchange for the following. Dr. Joseph Laspisa will agree to immediately enter into a professional drug rehabilitation program and seek additional counseling for his sexual obsessions. Dr. Joseph Laspisa will immediately give up his conscious sedation, controlled substance, and DEA license for a period of 2 years. Dr. Laspisa will pay damages in the sum of $150,000 tax-free US dollars over a period of 15 months in 15 equal monthly installments on the 15th of each month beginning August 15th. Pay off the consulting fees owed to Mrs. Roberts within 30 days. Pay for the hotel accommodations and course registration for Ms. Roberts to attend the NAHQ annual meeting, which is the National Association for Healthcare Quality, not to exceed $1,200 US dollars, to purchase 2 round-trip tickets for Mr. and Mrs. Roberts to travel to Australia this Christmas, not to exceed $3,800 US dollars. Additionally, Dr. Joseph Laspisa will pay for the replacement of her premium quality 2-carat diamond ring and 3-carat diamond tennis bracelet that were removed from her on the 11th of August while she was incapacitated prior to August 25th. In the event that the terms of the contract are not fulfilled as agreed, Mrs. Roberts reserves the right to report Dr. Joseph Laspisa to local law enforcement and regulatory agencies and to seek damages. Dr. Laspisa has agreed to be held liable for any and all expenses incurred by Mrs. Tracey Roberts as a result of his failure to uphold his portion of this agreement. Mrs. Roberts has insisted that it be noted that Dr. Laspisa initially offered her the sum of $300,000 US dollars, which, and the word which is misspelled, she rejected and made a counter proposal that was accepted and entered above. I don't know why it would make any sense for her to reject his offer of $300,000 and take less money and then a whole bunch of other miscellaneous stuff, plane tickets, hotel stays, jewelry, etc. Anyway, the end of the contract says, Dr. Laspisa wants to acknowledge that the recent payment of $18,000 to Mrs. Roberts was applied to his outstanding balance and that he has returned her high school, opal, and wedding band rings to her. Signed, Joseph A. Laspisa and Tracey Richter Roberts. And there were no dates next to their signatures. Okay, what the actual hell? This contract is all kinds of crazy, right? Now, we're not all the way through the story yet, so for now, this is sort of a he said, she said type of a thing. I pointed out some of the things that were wrong, the grammatical errors and the spelling errors, and there were some writing inconsistencies that you wouldn't find in an actual contract that was written by someone who knows what they're doing. And there not being a year listed when all of this allegedly took place, I think that could have rendered this contract void, not having the year on it. But I'm not a contract writing expert. But doesn't there have to be a year on it? Anyway, that's another matter. So the thing that really stood out to me the most is that as Tracey wrote up this contract, as she was starting to get into the terms of the agreement, doesn't it sound like she kind of sort of just started thinking up things to add to her list of demands as she was going along? It was like she was making a shopping list, but really it's an extortion list. If Dr. Laspisa's version of events is what happened and he was the one who was drugged. I mean, $150,000 plus plane tickets to Australia, plus registration and hotel for the NAHQ annual event, plus a 2-carat diamond ring, plus a 3-carat tennis bracelet. You know, when I said that the repercussions that Dr. Laspisa faced were kind of mild when we heard the initial version of the sexual misconduct encounter, now we can kind of see why that is. Because I think to the licensing board, Dr. Laspisa wasn't right to be having this tryst with Tracey in the first place in his office and using the nitrous oxide gas for fun because he needed some sort of disciplinary action taken for those things. I think it would be pretty easy to see that this man was clearly being extorted, because if he did sexually assault Tracey in the way that she described, he would have lost his license to practice for life. But based on what they heard at the hearing that they held for this, they felt like losing his license for a couple of months and a settlement of $6,500 was punishment enough. And that in and of itself leads me to believe that Tracey's story was a bunch of hooey-fooey baloney. So they ended up giving this whole thing a sweep this under the rug, get everybody to shut up about this, slap him on the wrist, slap her with a little bit of money, and nobody ever speak of this ever again type of settlement. Remember, the evening of the attack and shooting of Dustin, when detectives on the scene got Michael on the phone, he told them to make sure that they asked Tracey about Dr. Laspisa. And when they did, Tracey told them sort of the watered down need to know version of what happened. She said that he sedated her with drugs, and when she came to, she saw him masturbating, and she reported him to the licensing board that there was a hearing, he lost his license, and she was paid the settlement. Special Agent Valletta found this information about Dr. Laspisa in the case file, but discovered that he was never interviewed, and this information was never followed up on. So he went to Chicago and spoke to the dentist and got the he said side of the story. Dr. Laspisa told Valletta that when he came to after Tracey had drugged him, he found that contract and some Polaroid pictures, and he very quickly realized that his career and his reputation was on the line, and he panicked, and he gave in to Tracey's demands outlined in that contract. He was freaked out, and he didn't know what to do, so he signed the contract, and for quite some time, Dr. Laspisa was paying Tracey the extortion money. And remember when I said that the terms and conditions sounded like she just kept adding things as she was typing it up? Well, that continued to happen well after the ink had dried on their contract. Tracey kept asking for more and more and more beyond what was outlined in the signed contract, and there came a point where Dr. Laspisa could no longer be held hostage by this woman and thereby ceased making any and all payments to Tracey, which sent her through the roof. She went ballistic into the stratosphere, completely infuriated. So she followed through on that condition in the contract that if he did not meet the payment requirements, that she reserved the right to report him. And she did, and the outcome of which we already went over. With this information Special Agent Valletta was able to gather from Dr. Laspisa, he came to believe that Tracey Richter was quite a manipulative, diabolical conniver. Dr. Laspisa, by the way, dreamers, managed to salvage his career in dentistry, oral, and maxillofacial surgery, as I found him in the top results on Google when I looked him up, and he appears to be practicing in and around Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But anyway, the next person Valletta spoke to was the lucky one who got out of his marriage to Tracey before she really had a chance to sink her teeth into him, and that would be ex-husband number 1, father of her eldest son Bert, Dr. John Pittman. At one time, Dr. John was a serious contender for prime suspect in this case based on what was found written in that pink spiral-bound notebook. Dr. John told Valletta that at first, everything about Tracey was perfect. She was beautiful and smart. They had a wonderful wedding and were on their way to building a successful life together. But it didn't take long for it to start to fall apart. Tracey started lying to him. She would be gone all hours of the day and night. She had numerous affairs with several different men. She would be gone for days at a time. She would drain their joint bank account, vanishing with their money along with herself. Dr. John said he tried speaking to her about her behavior and their finances, but what would happen is her temper would just explode. She would become so violent that it was impossible to get anything through to her. It took very little for Tracey to just lose it. Then in August of 1991, things escalated to a point unlike anything ever before. And all of it was over Dr. John's muddy shoes. I guess he had set them inside the house by the door, and this caused Tracey to just blow a gasket. She screamed at him over these shoes, and he was like, "Dude, you're seriously losing it over nothing." This isn't anything to go this crazy over. And Tracey was like, you want to see crazy? And then she went into their bedroom, retrieved a gun, pointed it at him, and Dr. John told her to calm down, that she was literally going insane. And he tried to remove himself from the situation, but she ordered him to never walk away from her, and then she fired the gun up into the ceiling. Dr. John called 911, and when police arrived, Tracey explained that she and her husband had gotten into an argument that sort of got out of hand, but that she wasn't upset with him, she was upset with herself, and that after they fought that she had contemplated taking her own life, and just as she was about to shoot herself, she shot the gun towards the ceiling instead. Tracey was arrested and charged with illegally discharging a firearm. She was subsequently convicted and given 1 year of probation. Dr. John had reached a point where he was seriously reevaluating his judgment and his life choices, contemplated putting this marriage out of its misery once and for all, but Tracey managed to beg and plead for him to give her another chance. So they reconciled, and Tracey came back to the home to continue working through their marriage and to raise their son, who was at that time only 1.5 years old. And for that 1 year that Tracey was on probation, she was on her best and most perfect behavior. Dr. John would even say she was better than ever. Perfect wife, the perfect mom, exactly everything that he would have imagined life would have been like when he married his beautiful bride. But we all know too well by now that pretty on the outside doesn't always mean pretty on the inside. And once that 1 year of probation was up, Tracey was back to her old, self-indulgent, destructive ways. Gone all the time, infidelity, outrageous spending, the whole thing. So Dr. John finally left the marriage. In light of this further insight into Tracey, Special Agent Wehde could add violent and volatile to his picture that he was putting together of her, in addition to manipulative, diabolical, and conniving. Wehde put together his findings into his fresh look into Dustin's case and sent all of that over to the new district attorney of Sac County, Iowa, Mr. Ben Smith. So Ben Smith looked through the file that Wehde had sent to him, and for a long time he gazed at a photograph of Dustin lying face down in a pool of his own blood. He could see that Dustin had been shot 3 times in the back of the head. I believe one of those times was into the back of his neck. It was Tracey's story that Dustin was still moving and getting up to his feet, which was what prompted her to fire those 2 final shots, and that this was all justified, as it was in self-defense. Wehde sat there when Ben Smith was looking at that photograph and told him, yeah, 3 to the back of the head in self-defense. Chew on that for a few days. And Ben Smith was like, yeah, no, I don't need a few days. He could tell in the photo that there was no way Dustin was anywhere but laying face down on the ground when those final shots were fired. Ben Smith was sold that Tracey Richter put together some kind of evil, fiendish plot that ended in Dustin Wehde being shot to death. But now they have to find the evidence to build that case against her. They decided to start with the people who were close to Tracey at the time that the incident took place. People who Tracey may have been close friends with. People she may have opened up to, spoke to about things that might give investigators an idea of what exactly was going on and how Dustin became entangled in this woman's web. And they found someone that may potentially have some inside information, and that would be a woman named Mary Higgins. And this is a small town, right? It just so happened that Ben Smith knew Mary, and if his memory served him right, he remembered that she and Tracey were pretty good friends and still were. Mary was questioned back in 2001 and provided a statement to police following the shooting. Smith and Valletta reviewed her statement from back then, and they tracked her down and wanted to speak to her for a second time. And remember, this is some 8 or 9 years later after the fact. So the two of them spoke to Mary Higgins about Tracey shooting Dustin in person. And Mary indicated that she and Tracey were still good friends, that they had met back in 1998 when Tracey and Michael moved from Chicago too early. Not moved from Chicago too early, moved from the city of Chicago to the city of Early. And Mary felt like everything about Tracey was great. She was a refreshing new person in the small town. Mary really liked Tracey a lot, and they became fast friends. When they got to the topic of the night Dustin was shot to death, all Mary would say was that Tracey told her that someone attacked her and she shot him. But the investigators left that conversation with Mary feeling like she was really holding back more information. She wasn't being forthcoming with everything that she knew. It was the feeling that the original investigator back in 2001, when Mary was interviewed for the first time, he had the same feeling. And it was a feeling that Special Agent Valletta got the second time that he spoke to her some years later. But the difference is Valletta was hell-bent on prying it out of Mary. Whatever it was she was holding inside, he wanted it. Ben Smith, because he was somewhat acquainted with Mary, was leaning towards taking it what she was saying at face value, but Special Agent Valletta wouldn't let it go. He even said, "I'm going to park in front of that woman's house every single day until she tells me what she knows." So Ben Smith said that he would go with her and try to talk to her again, since he was somewhat of a familiar face. Ben Smith went into this conversation with Mary thinking, we'll just talk to her one more time and move on because, like I said, he believed her. And she said there was nothing more to say, so there was nothing more to say. She didn't have any more information for them. And that's how the second conversation with both Ben Smith and Valletta went. Mary just said there isn't anything else. But Valletta would not let up, and he really cranked up the pressure, telling Mary, "I know that there is more to the story, and I know you know what it is." And finally, Mary said something that completely broke this cold case wide open. She brought up that pink spiral notebook. And that was it. That was exactly what the investigators had been needing, because if you remember, that pink notebook was the one thing that nobody outside of the investigators on the case knew about. They never told anyone else about it. That information had been included in the case file along with the notebook itself. There is no way that Mary should have known about that notebook unless she was told about it by the person who was responsible for it. When she brought up the pink notebook, Ben Smith and Special Agent Valletta exchanged glances, and they knew that they were finally getting somewhere. So they asked Mary, "What pink notebook are you talking about?" And she said, "Tracey told me that the police found this pink notebook inside Dustin's car, and that because of what they found inside of that notebook, her ex-husband, Dr. John, would be arrested because he was the one behind the attack, that he was the one who put Dustin up to it." There was absolutely no way that Mary would randomly know all of these closely guarded details regarding the contents of that notebook that had never been made public. And they asked her, "How do you know about what's inside this notebook?" And she said she knew because Tracey told her. Back in January of 2002, 1 month after the shooting, Tracey asked Mary if she wanted to come over to hang out and talk since they hadn't seen each other since the shooting happened. And Mary had gone over there with the intentions of not wanting to bring up the shooting because she felt like the whole thing must have been really traumatizing, that she would just visit with Tracey, and if she wanted to bring it up and talk about it, then she would be willing to listen. But Mary wasn't going to ask about it at all. And much to Mary's surprise, it was actually the first thing that Tracey started talking about. Right out the gate, she brought it up and started going into some of the details. And it was then that Tracey said that Dustin had this pink notebook in his car where he wrote about John hiring him to kill her. Mary was floored. Tracey went on and said that the investigators were preparing to take Dr. John into custody and to charge him with Dustin's murder, along with charges related to the solicitation of murder for attempting to hire someone to kill her. Of course, upon hearing this, Mary was relieved that police were making progress on the case. So as Mary was telling this information to Ben Smith and Valletta, it was as if she had read the contents of the notebook herself. That's how detailed Tracey had been in telling her what was written in it. Tracey knew the contents of the notebook, and there was only one way that that was possible, that she took part in the writing of it. So why would Tracey tell Mary all this stuff? I mean, Tracey comes off as a somewhat reasonably intelligent person, and this was a pretty stupid thing to do. Share details about a case that investigators had not shared with her or with anybody else, including the media. Well, time and time again, dreamers, we find people like Tracey tend to think that they are the smartest people in the room, and time again, they do dumb things that end up biting them in the ass. Tracey just didn't put it together that this conversation she was having over a cup of coffee with her good friend would ever matter. And there were a lot of dots to connect for this to come back around the way that it did. But the important thing is that finally it did come back around. I don't know why Tracey told Mary about the notebook, but if I had to hazard a guess, I'd say it was because Tracey always had to be the center of attention. And one of her favorite ways to get that was to be a victim. But the fact is, of all the things that happened to Tracey, she never was a victim. Every story Tracey came up with where she cast herself or her son Bert as a victim, they were all lies. All of it was made up. It was everyone around Tracey who were her victims, not the other way around. When she fired that shot into the ceiling and was arrested for illegally discharging a firearm, Dr. John was the victim, yet she was the one who told police that she was suicidal. She accused Dr. John of sexually abusing Bert, an allegation that he was cleared of. She accused Dr. Laspisa of drugging her and sexually assaulting her in his dentist's office, which was clearly a case of her setting him up for an extortion plot. When Tracey confronted Michael aggressively screaming at him about a bankrupt client that owed them $20,000, and she ended up having him arrested for the domestic dispute, charges that were eventually dropped. Every single time, Tracey made herself out to be the victim. And she did it once again when she told Mary all these details that she should have never had knowledge of. The details that were in that pink notebook. So Tracey could, once again, be a victim. The victim of her ex-husband and of Dustin Wehde. The thing was, back in 2002, in the weeks and months following the attack and the shooting, Dr. John was not being arrested and charged with Dustin's murder. Mary was seeing no movement on the case, and she found this to be very concerning. Naturally, because you would be worried about your friend who has this crazy ex-husband that's out to try and kill her, and he's still free to try again. Like, what's the deal? So Mary asked Tracey about why haven't they arrested him? What are they waiting for? Don't the police have Dustin's notebook with all that information about him being hired to kill her? And by the time Mary brought all this up in a follow-up conversation on this, Tracey seemed to have become aware that the existence of that notebook is something that police have not asked her about. They've not shown it to her. They've not mentioned it. It's not being talked about in the media. So when Mary brought it up some months later, it had dawned on Tracey that Mary should not know about that, because Tracey should not know about it either. In the moment, Tracey understood that nobody should have knowledge of the existence of that notebook, and she realized that she never should have said anything about it to Mary, but she couldn't help herself because she has to be a victim. Tracey gave Mary a really hard, stern look and said, "Forget about that notebook. Completely forget about it and make sure that you never, ever bring it up again. Not to me, not to anyone ever." And by the look on Tracey's face, when she asked if Mary understood what she was saying, Mary became filled with a great deal of fear all of a sudden. She realized at that point just how dangerous Tracey Richter was and could be. Mary was fearful for her safety and for the safety of her family, because now she's realizing that she's probably staring at someone who probably did not kill Dustin in self-defense. Mary assured Tracey that, okay, she'll forget about it. And there Mary was, nearly 10 years later, telling these investigators how Tracey warned her to never mention that notebook ever again, and she told them that she had been afraid to say anything ever since. Once Mary told the investigators about the notebook, she was able to provide them with enough information to prove that the person responsible for it and the things that were written in it was Tracey herself. By then, investigators already knew that, but it was getting this direct corroboration from Mary that was the key piece of evidence they needed, this independent corroboration. And with that, Special Agent Valletta came up with his theory of what most likely happened leading up to Dustin Wehde being shot and killed by Tracey Richter. It was theorized that Dustin Wehde came over to Tracey's house because he was invited by Tracey herself. He had arrived sometime in the late afternoon or early evening. Remember, Tracey said that Dustin had stopped by earlier on in the day of the shooting, but she didn't have time to talk to him because she was busy with her kids. She somehow lured Dustin over, and it really isn't a stretch to think that Dustin wasn't all that hard to convince or even manipulate, because he was young and vulnerable and also raging with hormones, and Tracey is very good at being a terrible human. So Tracey had Dustin sit down with this pink spiral-bound notebook, and she managed to get him to write the things that were found on the pages of that notebook that were in his own handwriting. From the way it sounded, it appeared as if she was just feeding the information to Dustin and he was writing as they went along. Tracey could have just told him that she was writing a story or keeping a record of things that happened in her first marriage to Dr. John. Whatever it was that she told Dustin, he seemed to have just gone along with whatever it was she was telling him to do. When asked, Dustin's mom, Mona, was certain that Dustin wouldn't be the type of person to sit down and write things in a journal. He didn't like to write. He wouldn't keep a journal. And it is strongly believed that Tracey managed to get Dustin to go along with this using what she had always used: sex appeal. Based on what we know, it's likely that Tracey seduced Dustin, and when you think about it, he was really the perfect person. Just vulnerable and naive enough to fall right into her trap. And in addition to that, if we're being honest, it is not difficult at all to seduce a 20-year-old man. Investigators then opined that sometime after he finished writing what she told him to write in that pink spiral notebook, Tracey then lured Dustin up the stairs for sex, and as soon as she got him into the bedroom, she produced a gun and started firing straight at him. Based on the way the bullets went into him, there was no way that those bullets hit with that kind of precision if they were in a life and death struggle as Tracey had described back in 2001. She did not land those shots by aiming that gun backwards over her shoulder. She had said that her hands were bound in front of her and that the lights were off and that she was being strangled. Nobody's going to land 9 out of 11 shots the way that she did. Dustin was standing right there looking at her, expecting to have a good time, and this woman just gunned him down in cold blood. It's very Pamela Hupp-esque, isn't it? Remember how she lured a very naive, vulnerable, and additionally disabled Louis Gumpenberger to her home with promises of a quick and easy money-making job, only to shoot him dead for the exact same reasons Tracey Richter lured Dustin Wehde in? To frame someone for murder in order to clear the way to get what they wanted. Women like Pam Hupp and Tracey Richter are cut from the exact same evil cloth, and they prey on the weak and vulnerable. While Dustin was either dead or dying on Tracey's bedroom floor, it was then investigators believed that she planted the spiral-bound notebook on the front passenger seat of his car, which was parked in her driveway, thinking that the contents of it, the things that Dustin wrote down, would prove that she killed him in an act of self-defense, and at the same time point the whole entire murder-for-hire plan at her ex-husband, Dr. John, to whom she was on the verge of losing custody of her 11-year-old son. Tracey actually had it in her mind that she was actually going to get away with this harebrained plan and frame Dr. John and live diabolically ever after. She would be able to bring a copy of that notebook into the custody hearing and not only keep sole custody of Bert, but also potentially send her ex-husband to prison for the rest of his life. For investigators, this was a clear-cut case of murder. After planting that notebook in Dustin's car, Tracey then self-inflicted some wounds on her neck to make it appear as though she had been strangled. I will post pictures of the wound that she created on her neck, and investigators never really thought that those marks appeared to have been made in a struggle. They don't look like she'd been dragged down the hallway with a pair of pantyhose around her neck like she had described. And not only was Dustin not an intruder, but instead an invited guest, there was also never a second intruder involved. All of that was fabricated by Tracey. And this woman did all of this while her 11-year-old, her 3-year-old, and her 1-year-old were in the next room down the hall. And taking this to next level evil, this woman coached her 11-year-old, Bert, as to exactly what to say to the police on the 911 call and when they arrived at the scene. And she put him up to making that call instead of calling herself. Bert was just at that right age to be able to do as he was told and to be believed by police when he told it. When investigators re-listened to that recorded call, it did sound very rehearsed to them. And that's because it was. In July of 2011, Tracey was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Dustin Wehde. She was put on trial and very quickly convicted on November 7th, 2011, a little more than 1 month shy of the 10th anniversary of Dustin's murder. Tracey was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. All of her appeals have been denied, and she is still sitting in the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women in Mitchellville, Iowa. She will be 57 years old next month in May. At trial, Mary Higgins, Tracey's friend who basically helped investigators crack Dustin's cold case, testified. She stated that she and Tracey were good friends and that right after the shooting, Tracey and her family went to Australia for several weeks. When she came back, that is when Tracey first started talking about the shooting, but Mary noted that Tracey was pretty matter-of-fact about it, describing it like she was reciting her grocery list, acting completely and totally emotionless. She talked about how she, quote-unquote, unloaded the gun as she was being pulled by 2 intruders, and that when she got up, she stepped over the body like it was a pile of dirty laundry to go check on her kids. And then she took her 3 children with her, and that the body was there, and Tracey told Mary that it was still moving. So she stood over him and said, "Stop moving or I'll blow your effing brains out." And he continued to move despite her warning. So she stood over him and fired the gun until he stopped. And then she continued down the stairs with her 3 children in tow. Mary said that while Tracey was recounting the details of what happened that night, Bert had come into the room where they were sitting and talking, and when he heard what Tracey was talking about, all of a sudden he became extremely agitated, and he started banging his head against the table and yelling, "Why did you go up there? Why did you go back up there? You didn't have to shoot him. You didn't have to kill him." Mary also testified that Tracey told her that police found an older model computer and a pink notebook in Dustin's car that was left in her driveway the night of the purported home invasion. Tracey described to Mary the details of the contents of that pink notebook, which included contact information for her first husband, Dr. John Pittman, with whom Tracey was involved in a custody dispute. Tracey told Mary that the notebook would prove that her ex-husband was involved. As stated, there was evidence that the contents of the notebook had been kept from the public by law enforcement and that Tracey should not have known what was written in it. Mary also recounted an incident in 2004 when Tracey stuck her finger in her face and told her to forget about the notebook. At the trial, the state argued that the contents of the notebook referring to Tracey's ex-husband and his detailed plans to have Tracey and Bert killed came from Tracey herself in an attempt to win the custody dispute over Bert. Tracey's claims of self-defense fell on 12 pairs of deaf ears, as the jury unanimously found her guilty of first-degree murder. Bert, who was 11 years old at the time of the shooting, testified at his mom's trial. He would have been 21 years old by then. He said that he was watching TV in his room when he heard his mom yelling for help down the hall. After Tracey was pulled away from the door to Bert's room, he heard banging around in the hallway. He reported hearing his mom making a very awful choking sound for a few minutes. Dustin, whom Bert knew from previous interactions, came to his bedroom and threatened Bert. Later, Bert said he heard footsteps running away from his room, followed by yelling and several loud bangs. Tracey then opened the door to Bert's room. He said her wrists were bound by pantyhose. Bert then followed his mother, who had a gun in each hand. He said Dustin, who was lying on the floor, started to move. He then said he heard his mother warn Dustin to not move, followed by a couple of shots. On cross-examination, Bert agreed that his interview with police on the night of the shooting was his most accurate recall of the incident. In that police interview, which occurred within hours of the shooting, Bert said nothing about his mom being pulled away from his room, nothing about hearing banging and kicking noises in the hallway, and nothing about hearing choking noises. Nor did Bert say in the first interview that he saw Dustin moving or trying to get up, and he did not say that he heard his mom telling Dustin to stay down. So while it's probably not a good idea for an attorney to sit there and attack someone who went through something so traumatic as Bert did, but I think it's pretty clear that his testimony had most likely been ingrained in him over the last 10 years, and many of those are formative years, if not all of them. And Bert was telling the version that his mom had basically brainwashed him with. And that is totally not his fault that his mom would do something like that, drag her 11-year-old into this murderous plan. And I mean, that's even giving Pam Hupp a run for her money for Most Evil Woman of the Year. It's really sad that Bert's whole life has been about being his mother's dutiful little pawn. Tracey Richter is one evil woman. There is a little silver lining to this whole story that gives us a measure of satisfaction. In 2014, the Iowa courts banned Tracey from spending any money during her stay in prison, which is forever in her case. Not one single penny can Tracey use for anything, and everything that she gets put onto her books is automatically seized by the state in order to pay off her $240,000 court and restitution bills. Tracey can't even buy hygiene products, The only thing she's going to have access to is the free stuff that the jail gives her, like a bar of soap. Maybe she can use that to wash herself, her hair, and her teeth. Actually, I don't know what prisons provide and what they could buy from the commissary, but I'm sure the free stuff sucks. And Tracey's mom said that she has no access to toothpaste or shampoo. And there's nothing that anyone can do about it. So Tracey's just going to have to get creative. She can't buy any food from the commissary. No ramen noodles, no honey buns, no instant coffee. Tracey can't even make phone calls. She has to have money on a phone account in order to call out. And that automatically gets garnished if someone puts money on that too. The Iowa State Department of Corrections director said that he can't ever remember a court ordering something like this on any inmate ever before, and even normally the phone account is usually exempt from being garnished for restitution, so this is something that really seems directly targeted at Tracey, tailored especially for her. Whether you or I disagree with this type of order against a prisoner, it doesn't matter, because District Attorney Ben Smith said Dustin's mom doesn't get to call her son ever again, so why should Tracey be able to? And that restitution money goes to Dustin's mom, Mona. But you know what? I think Tracey is doing all right. I saw a picture of her with Bert, and she actually looks really healthy and well-groomed. So, if you're worried about it, which I don't think you are, she's doing okay. And also, dreamers, I'm going to back up a little bit into the story. Remember when I was talking about Tracey and her second husband, that Australian entrepreneur, and I said something about them having an internet-based business that they operated out of their home, and I didn't really know what it was? Well, I don't know what Michael's online business was back then with Tracey, but I did find him on LinkedIn, and since 2008, he has operated Rexfield.com. And on this website, Michael is the founder, and they are an internet victims advocate and expert witness, digital forensics analyst, electronic discovery, and litigation support consultants. Michael is said to be the world's first professional internet bounty hunter. A past victim himself, Michael has good reason to dedicate his professional life to catching criminals hiding behind internet anonymity. A victim himself? Gee, I wonder who he may be referring to. Previously, Michael coordinated digital forensics and computer hacking education for the armed forces. Other clients included, that's the United States Armed Forces. Other clients included NATO, the Australian military, the United Nations, just to name a few. Michael now consults for private and law enforcement clients. He has helped bullied school children, celebrities, CEOs, and heads of state. His record time for identifying an internet troll was just 17 minutes in a case where an attorney general in the U.S. had already spent more than $100,000 of taxpayers' money with 5 attorneys and a grand jury in futile attempts to identify a rogue tweeter. Michael was also engaged as a civilian agent in a multi-agency national manhunt for a murder fugitive in 2013. He located that suspect in just 73 minutes, which led to his arrest by U.S. Marshals. All the links to this stuff is on Michael's website, which I'll include on the show notes. Michael is also the co-founder of PICDU.org, Public International Cybercrime Disruption Organization, a charity dedicated to combating cybercrimes and human trafficking. As I said, I don't exactly know what Michael and Tracey did together online during their marriage, but I think it's safe to say that the direction Michael's life has since gone was probably inspired, at least in part, by the events that we discussed today. And I didn't want to tell you about all this too early on in the episode because I didn't want to spoil it for you, because he was a suspect for a while. After his divorce from Tracey, Michael moved to California for a while, and eventually he found his way back to Brisbane, Queensland. I also found Dr. John online. He's still a surgeon doing his thing. As is Dr. Laspisa, Tracey Richter tried to ruin lives, and she certainly ruined Dustin's and his family, but fortunately, the only other life she ruined permanently was her own, and she's paying dearly for it. Another person also paying the price for her actions are her 3 children. The 2 younger ones are living private lives back in Australia with their father, but Bert, he's still paying the price for his mother's behavior, except it doesn't seem like he knows it or wants to know it. Bert appears to have been spending pretty much his entire adult life advocating for his mom's release, insisting that she was wrongly convicted, that she is innocent, that she did nothing but protect him and his younger siblings. Bert runs a Facebook page and has a fundraiser, but it seems as though most of those sites are on pause at the moment. I don't think Bert is giving up on believing in his mom. I just think he might be starting to give up on the idea that she will ever walk free again. And that is the disputed death of Dustin Wehde. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I will be back next week with the next installment of California Dreaming. And as always, until next time, sweet dreams.